Imagine a shadow government, operating in plain sight, yet hidden behind layers of secrecy. Not a conspiracy theory, but a historical reality. Today, we pull back the curtain on an organization that has profoundly, and often invisibly, shaped the course of nations. We're talking about the Central Intelligence Agency and how its quiet interventions have drastically altered the destinies of countries around the globe. The world after World War II was a landscape of rebuilding and, crucially, of ideological struggle. The United States, emerging as a superpower, found itself in a new kind of conflict, one fought not just with bombs and bullets, but with ideas, influence, and the subtle manipulation of political landscapes. This was the dawn of the Cold War, and in this volatile environment, the need for a centralized intelligence gathering and covert action agency became paramount. Enter the CIA. Established in 1947, its mandate was broad: to collect, analyze, and disseminate national security information. But its true power, and its most controversial legacy, lay in its capacity for covert action. This wasn't about simply observing, it was about intervening. It was about subtly nudging events, supporting favored factions, and undermining those deemed hostile to American interests. Why such a need for secrecy? The very nature of intelligence work demands it. But in the context of the Cold War, the stakes were unimaginably high. The fear of communist expansion was palpable. Every tremor of political instability, every whisper of dissent in a far-off land, was viewed through the lens of this existential threat. And the CIA, with its vast resources and its authorized mandate for discrete operations, became the instrument through which the United States sought to counter this perceived threat. But what does covert action actually mean? It's a broad term, encompassing a range of activities designed to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, without the overt attribution to the U.S. government. This could mean anything from propaganda campaigns to funding political parties to orchestrating coups d'état. The goal was always the same: to achieve American foreign policy objectives without the messy, public entanglement of direct military intervention. Consider the early years. The Soviet Union was consolidating its power in Eastern Europe, and the specter of communist influence spreading further was a genuine concern for Washington. The CIA's initial forays into covert action were often focused on bolstering anti-communist forces within these nascent communist states. They weren't necessarily about overthrowing governments, but about ensuring that the narrative, the political discourse, remained tilted in favor of the West. This involved disseminating information, supporting independent media where possible, and providing resources to groups that could offer an alternative to the official communist line. One of the earliest and most significant examples of CIA intervention, and a clear bellwether for what was to come, occurred in Italy in the late 1940s. Italy was teetering on the brink. The powerful Italian Communist Party, backed by the Soviet Union, was a formidable political force, poised to win the upcoming elections. The United States, fearing a communist Italy so close to its strategic interests in the Mediterranean, saw this as a critical battleground. The CIA deployed a massive, multi-pronged operation. It wasn't about sending in troops. It was about waging a war of information and influence. They poured money into anti-communist political parties, primarily the Christian Democrats. This funding helped them to organize rallies, produce pamphlets and posters, and broadcast radio messages. They also engaged in extensive propaganda efforts, highlighting the supposed dangers of communism and the benefits of aligning with the West. This included distributing leaflets, even using Hollywood celebrities to record messages urging Italians to vote against the communists. The extent of this intervention was staggering. Millions of dollars were spent, translating into a significant portion of the anti-communist campaign budget. It was a calculated gamble, a belief that money and targeted messaging could sway the outcome of a democratic election, and in the end, it appears to have worked. The Christian Democrats won a decisive victory, and Italy remained firmly within the Western sphere of influence. But this success came at a cost and raised profound questions. Was it legitimate for a foreign power to so heavily influence the electoral process of another sovereign nation? Did this undermine the very democratic principles the United States claimed to uphold? These were debates that would rage for decades, and the Italian election was just the opening salvo. The pattern established in Italy became a template for future operations. The CIA found fertile ground for intervention in countries struggling with political instability. Newly independent nations grappling with their identity, and regions where the Cold War rivalry played out in proxy conflicts, and the tools of intervention evolved. Beyond propaganda and financial aid, the agency began to explore more direct methods. The 1950s saw a dramatic escalation in the scope and ambition of CIA covert actions. The agency became adept at identifying and cultivating local contacts, individuals who could act as intermediaries and agents of influence. These weren't always shadowy figures in trench coats. They could be journalists, academics, union leaders, even disgruntled military officers. The CIA provided them with training, resources, and, crucially, a sense of purpose aligned with American objectives. One of the most notorious examples of this era, and perhaps the most defining moment in the early history of CIA covert operations, took place in Iran in 1953. Iran, a nation rich in oil, was led by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was a nationalist, and his most significant act was the nationalization of Iran's oil industry, which had been largely controlled by the British. This move was deeply unpopular with both Britain and the United States, who saw it as a threat to Western economic interests and a potential opening for Soviet influence. The CIA, under the codename Operation Ajax, orchestrated a coup d'etat to remove Mossadegh from power. This was a complex and meticulously planned operation. It involved bribing military officials and politicians, spreading disinformation to create an atmosphere of chaos, and orchestrating public demonstrations against Mossadegh. The goal was to destabilize his government and pave the way for the return of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was seen as more amenable to Western interests. The operation was a success. Mossadegh was overthrown, and the Shah was reinstated. The Shah, in return, agreed to a new oil deal that significantly benefited Western oil companies. The CIA, in this instance, had directly intervened to alter the political leadership of a sovereign nation, all in the name of preventing perceived communist encroachment and securing vital resources. The success of Operation Ajax emboldened the CIA and its proponents. It demonstrated the agency's ability to achieve significant geopolitical objectives through clandestine means. It reinforced the belief that direct intervention, when executed with precision and secrecy, could effectively advance American foreign policy goals. However, it also sowed seeds of resentment and mistrust, particularly within Iran, that would have long-lasting consequences. Following Iran, the stage was set for further interventions. The domino theory, the belief that if one country fell to communism, others would inevitably follow, was a driving force behind American foreign policy during this period. This fear, coupled with a genuine desire to shape the global order in line with American values and interests, led the CIA to engage in a wide range of covert activities across the developing world. Consider Guatemala in 1954. This Central American nation was led by President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. Arbenz had initiated land reforms that threatened the interests of the powerful American fruit company, the United Fruit Company. These reforms involved redistributing unused land to peasants, a move that the company and its powerful lobbyists in Washington viewed as a direct assault on their property rights. The CIA, again acting on behalf of perceived American economic interests and the overarching fear of communist influence, launched Operation PB Success. This operation involved training and arming a force of Guatemalan exiles, who then launched an invasion of Guatemala. The CIA also engaged in a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign, using radio broadcasts and propaganda to create the impression of a widespread popular uprising and to sow fear and disunity within the Guatemalan army. The resulting instability and the pressure from the U.S.-backed rebels led to Arbenz's resignation and exile. A military junta took power, and the land reforms were rolled back. The United Fruit Company's interests were protected, and Guatemala was firmly brought back into the American orbit. The CIA had once again demonstrated its ability to decisively alter the political landscape of a nation, removing a democratically elected leader deemed unfavorable to American economic and strategic interests. These early interventions, while often framed as necessary bulwarks against communism, highlight a recurring theme: the intertwined nature of American foreign policy, economic interests, and the CIA's covert capabilities. It raises the question, where did the line blur between protecting national security and advancing purely economic or ideological agendas? Was the fight against communism a genuine concern or a convenient justification for a broader agenda of global influence? The CIA's operations were not confined to Latin America or the Middle East. The agency's reach extended to Africa, Asia, and Europe. In each region, the specific context and the perceived threats dictated the nature of the intervention. But the underlying principle remained the same: to influence events from the shadows, to shape outcomes without direct, overt U.S. involvement. The agency became a master of information warfare, not just through traditional propaganda, but by supporting sympathetic media outlets, funding think tanks, and even creating front organizations to funnel money and influence to favored political groups. This was a subtle, insidious form of power, where perceptions could be manufactured and public opinion subtly guided. But what were the ultimate consequences of these actions? Did they truly create a more stable and democratic world, as proponents would argue? Or did they, in fact, sow the seeds of future conflict and resentment, creating long-term instability and undermining the very democratic ideals they claimed to champion? The historical record suggests a more complex and often troubling answer. The seeds of American influence, sown with such deliberate precision in Italy, Iran, and Guatemala, began to sprout across a far wider, more complex geopolitical terrain. The dawn of the Cold War had ushered in an era where the perceived existential threat of communism served as the paramount justification for an array of covert actions, each designed to subtly, or not so subtly, reroute the trajectory of nations. The CIA, an instrument forged in the crucible of this ideological struggle, proved remarkably adept at navigating this volatile environment, its operations becoming increasingly sophisticated and far-reaching. The agency's mandate, initially focused on intelligence gathering, rapidly expanded to encompass the proactive shaping of political outcomes. This evolution was not a sudden, dramatic shift, but rather a gradual, almost imperceptible creep into the realm of active intervention. Each successful operation, each perceived victory against Soviet encroachment, seemed to embolden further action, expanding the agency's reach and its willingness to engage in activities that existed in the grayest of ethical and legal shadows. The very nature of intelligence work, shrouded in secrecy and driven by the imperative to anticipate and neutralize threats, lent itself to this expansion. Why merely gather information when that information could be used to prevent a perceived danger from materializing in the first place? This philosophical pivot was profoundly significant. It transformed the CIA from a passive observer into an active participant in the global theater, a player capable of altering the fundamental dynamics of power within sovereign nations. The methods employed were as varied as the contexts in which they were deployed. Propaganda, meticulously crafted and disseminated, became a potent weapon, capable of swaying public opinion, discrediting opposition, and fostering a climate favorable to American interests. Financial support, channeled through ostensibly legitimate organizations or directly into the coffers of favored political factions, ensured that anti-communist movements or those aligned with Washington's objectives had the resources to compete and often to prevail. Beyond these more overtly political maneuvers, the CIA also engaged in more direct forms of intervention. This could range from providing training and logistical support to friendly forces, to orchestrating clandestine operations designed to destabilize regimes deemed hostile. The line between protecting national security and advancing purely economic or ideological agendas often became blurred, a consequence of the complex interplay of interests that defined the Cold War. The domino theory, a pervasive fear that the fall of one nation to communism would inevitably lead to the collapse of others, fueled a sense of urgency that often overrode concerns about national sovereignty or the democratic will of the people. The post-war period was a fertile ground for such interventions. Newly independent nations, often grappling with internal divisions and seeking to define their own paths in a bipolar world, were particularly susceptible to external influence. The CIA, armed with substantial resources and a clear mandate to counter Soviet expansion, found opportunities to apply its burgeoning expertise across continents. Africa, Asia, and Europe all became theaters of operation, each with its unique set of challenges and opportunities for American intervention. Consider the broader implications of these early successes. The narrative that emerged was one of the United States, through its intelligence apparatus, acting as a bulwark against totalitarianism, a protector of freedom and democracy. This was the public-facing justification, the readily digestible explanation for actions that were, by their very nature, clandestine. Yet beneath this veneer of noble purpose lay a more complex reality. The interventions were not solely driven by altruism. They were deeply intertwined with the economic and strategic interests of the United States. The protection of American investments, the securing of vital resources, and the establishment of geopolitical alliances were all significant motivators, often intertwined with, and sometimes overshadowing, the ideological struggle. The question of legitimacy, of course, hung heavily over these operations. Was it appropriate or even permissible for a foreign power to so profoundly influence the internal political processes of another sovereign nation? The architects of these interventions would argue that the existential threat of communism justified extraordinary measures. They would point to Soviet interference in the affairs of other countries as a parallel, a justification for a defensive posture. Yet for those on the receiving end, for the citizens whose political futures were being manipulated from afar, the implications were often devastating. The erosion of democratic processes, the installation of compliant regimes, and the suppression of dissent were all potential consequences, leaving legacies of resentment and instability that could fester for decades. The CIA's operational doctrine, refined through these early experiences, began to solidify. It was a doctrine that emphasized discretion, deniability, and the deployment of assets in ways that minimized direct attribution to the United States. This often involved the use of cutout organizations, front groups, and carefully cultivated local intermediaries. The goal was not simply to achieve a desired outcome, but to do so in a manner that allowed the U.S. government to plausibly deny any involvement, thereby preserving diplomatic flexibility and avoiding international condemnation. This pursuit of deniability, while strategically sound, further contributed to the opacity and controversy surrounding the agency's activities. The success of Operation Ajax in Iran, for instance, demonstrated the potent effectiveness of a well-executed coup. The careful cultivation of contacts within the Iranian military and political establishment, combined with a sophisticated propaganda campaign that amplified fears of communist takeover and instability, created the conditions for Mossadegh's downfall. The subsequent reinstatement of the Shah, a monarch amenable to Western interests, secured not only oil access, but also a strategically important ally in a volatile region. The operation, however, also sowed the seeds of future discontent, creating a deep-seated resentment towards American interference that would have long-lasting repercussions. Similarly, Operation PB's success in Guatemala illustrated the agency's willingness to employ a broad spectrum of tactics to achieve its objectives. The creation of a liberation army composed of Guatemalan exiles, armed and trained by the CIA, was a critical component. This was coupled with a relentless psychological warfare campaign, broadcast over radio and disseminated through leaflets, that exaggerated the strength of the invading force and depicted President Arbenz as a Soviet puppet. This combination of military pressure and propaganda proved devastatingly effective, leading to Arbenz's resignation and the installation of a military junta that would reverse his land reforms and usher in decades of authoritarian rule. The United Fruit Company, a powerful American corporation whose vast landholdings were threatened by Arbenz's reforms, emerged as a significant beneficiary of this intervention. These were not isolated incidents, but rather the early chapters in a much larger, more complex narrative. The CIA's quiet interventions, born out of the exigencies of the Cold War, established a precedent for engagement that would continue to shape global affairs for decades to come. The agency became a shadow government, operating in plain sight, yet hidden behind layers of secrecy, its actions often dictating the course of nations without the knowledge or consent of their citizens. The profound impact of these clandestine operations on the nations targeted and on the broader international order would continue to be debated, analyzed, and in many cases, only imperfectly understood, long after the immediate objectives had been achieved. The world had entered a new era, one where the unseen hand of intelligence agencies could, and often did, wield as much power as any overt diplomatic or military force. The shadow government, a spectral entity operating in plain sight yet meticulously concealed behind impenetrable layers of secrecy, demonstrated an almost preternatural adeptness at navigating the tempestuous geopolitical waters of the nascent Cold War. Its architects, men of foresight and often ruthless pragmatism, understood a fundamental truth. In this new, ideological theater of global conflict, influence was a currency far more potent and valuable than the glittering allure of gold, and perception, a battlefield more critical and decisive than any ravaged landscape in Europe or Asia. The very essence of intelligence work, a discipline intrinsically predicated on the unseen, the unacknowledged, and the deliberately obscured, demanded a profound and unwavering commitment to operational discretion. Yet, the sheer scale and burgeoning ambition of the Central Intelligence Agency's covert actions soon began to transcend the circumscribed boundaries of mere intelligence gathering. They evolved with chilling efficiency into a sophisticated, multi-pronged strategy, meticulously designed to sculpt political outcomes, to gently, or sometimes forcefully, nudge nascent democracies toward paths deemed intrinsically favorable to American national interests, and to actively and aggressively undermine those nations or movements perceived as inherently hostile to the American way of life and its global aspirations. This was a stark departure from the overt diplomacy of polished ambassadors meticulously crafted trade agreements, and public pronouncements delivered from podiums. This was a profoundly different and infinitely more potent kind of engagement. It was a clandestine choreography of power, a silent ballet of influence played out in the dimly lit backrooms of foreign capitals through hushed, untraceable channels and fueled by anonymous, untraceable funding. The overarching objective, a singular and unwavering imperative, was crystal clear: to present an unassailable, united, and resolutely anti-communist front to the watching world, and where absolutely necessary, to ensure with unwavering resolve that nations, particularly those newly independent and struggling to forge their own destinies in the aftermath of devastating wars, did not drift inexorably into the chilling embrace of the Soviet orbit. The justification, invariably and consistently invoked, was the paramount and non-negotiable need for national security and the unwavering preservation of global stability against the perceived monolithic, existential threat of communism. Yet, as these interventions became increasingly frequent, increasingly audacious, and increasingly far-reaching, a far more complex and morally ambiguous reality began to inexorably emerge. One where the ostensibly clear lines between the noble pursuit of protecting national security and the more self-serving advancement of purely economic or ideological agendas became increasingly and disturbingly blurred. The pattern, so effectively and decisively established in the crucial Italian election, though narrowly focused on a single electoral contest, offered a potent and readily applicable blueprint. It definitively demonstrated that the CIA possessed not only the formidable capacity and the vast resources, but, crucially, the unhesitating willingness to engage in extensive, albeit entirely covert, political campaigning abroad. This was not an isolated incident, a singular aberration. It was, in retrospect, the undeniable dawn of a new, and in many ways, more perilous era of American foreign policy. This was an era where the agency would ascend to become a principal and often the most potent instrument in the escalating ideological struggle that defined the post-war world. The agency, a dynamic and adaptive organism, learned rapidly from its experiences, refining its clandestine techniques, perfecting its operational methodologies, and relentlessly expanding its reach across the globe. What had begun as a seemingly defensive measure, a strategic response to perceived Soviet aggression and expansion, rapidly and alarmingly transformed into an overtly offensive posture, an aggressive and proactive effort to actively mold and direct the political destinies of other sovereign nations. The success, or at least the widely perceived and trumpeted success, in Italy served as a powerful emboldening agent for the agency. The nascent and deeply unsettling notion of the domino theory, the insidious idea that if one strategically important nation fell to the insidious grasp of communism, then others in the surrounding region would inevitably and inexorably follow suit, provided a potent and persuasive rhetorical framework. This theory became the powerful, almost irrefutable justification for increasingly aggressive and widespread interventions. This theory, though subject to intense debate and often fervent criticism from those who saw its flaws, served as a potent, almost addictive, catalyst. It created a pervasive and palpable sense of existential urgency that permeated every level of U.S. foreign policy decision-making. The CIA, with its unique and unparalleled access to sensitive information and its broad, often unchecked mandate for action, became the primary and most effective executor of this doctrine within the shadowy, clandestine realm of covert operations. The agency's operations were rarely, if ever, singular, dramatic, or easily identifiable events. Instead, they were meticulously orchestrated, multifaceted campaigns, often involving a carefully calibrated combination of diverse and often unorthodox tactics. These could include the widespread dissemination of propaganda, carefully crafted and strategically deployed to subtly sway public opinion, to sow seeds of doubt, or to actively discredit particular political leaders or movements deemed undesirable. Financial support was another common and highly effective tool, meticulously channeled through a labyrinthine network of cutouts and intermediaries to political parties, influential labor unions, or strategically important media outlets that demonstrably aligned with U.S. objectives. In numerous instances, the CIA would actively cultivate, nurture, and overtly support opposition movements, providing them with essential training, vital equipment, and crucial strategic guidance. The ultimate goal, the elusive endgame, was always to achieve the desired outcome with absolute plausible deniability, ensuring that any potential backlash, any public outcry, or any international condemnation would not directly implicate or embarrass the United States government. The very clandestine nature of these operations inherently meant that their full scope, their true extent, and their profound, often long-lasting impact were frequently obscured, deliberately hidden from public view, and even from the knowledge of many within the U.S. government itself. The agency operated within a carefully constructed reality, a carefully curated and controlled environment of intermediaries, shell corporations, and meticulously managed information flows. This pervasive secrecy, while undeniably essential for operational effectiveness and the preservation of deniability, also inadvertently fostered an environment where ethical considerations could be easily sidelined, where moral qualms could be suppressed, and where the long-term, potentially devastating consequences of actions were often relegated to a secondary or even tertiary concern, eclipsed by the immediate and overriding objective of achieving a desired, tangible political result. The agents and operatives tasked with executing these sensitive and often morally compromising missions were frequently driven by an unwavering sense of duty, a deep-seated patriotism, and an unshakable belief in the inherent righteousness of their cause. However, they were also working within a systemic framework that, above all else, prioritized results, demanding success at any cost, often irrespective of the ethical or human price. The global landscape of the late 1940s and early 1950s presented a remarkably fertile ground for such ambitious and far-reaching interventions. Newly independent nations, often emerging from the suffocating legacies of colonialism and struggling to chart their own unique paths forward, were inherently vulnerable. Many of these nations were blessed with abundant natural resources, possessed strategically vital locations, or occupied ideologically significant positions on the global stage, making them immediate focal points for the intensifying superpower rivalry. In this volatile and opportune environment, the CIA found an almost inexhaustible supply of opportunities to apply its ever-expanding and increasingly sophisticated toolkit. The agency